Kelp forests are disappearing fast, and with them, we lose one of the most powerful life support systems the ocean has to offer. They shape entire ecosystems, feed communities, buffer coastlines, and even help stabilize our climate. Yet most people barely think about them unless they see seaweed washed up on the beach. Today, we change that. Scott Bohachyk is here from Oceanwise. He joins us on the show to reveal how seaforestation is becoming one of the most exciting and overlooked solutions for ocean health, climate resilience, and community well-being. We're going to talk to Scott on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, marine biologist and science communicator, here to tell you what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And today we're going to be talking about seaweed, not seagrass, which is much different than the podcast I'm trying to start called The Seagrass Effect, which you can go to speakupforblue.com/seagrass to help crowdfund that sucker to get it going. And let's talk about seagrass. Today we're going to be talking about a seaweed, a particularly important seaweed called kelp, and the kelp forests that they create and how they help shape biodiversity, how they help shape ecosystems, how they sequester carbon, how they are a climate change mechanism to bring climate change down. This is the be-all and end-all of habitats that we don't talk about. And why don't we talk about them? Maybe it's because they're not as sexy in terms of coral reefs, right? They don't have these brilliant colors. They're green, sometimes a little orangey, sometimes different types of green, sometimes a little brown, but they are in these beautiful habitats. Maybe not clear water, maybe that's why they're not sexy, but they have all of these animals that are around it, from invertebrates like sea urchins and starfish to marine mammals like sea otters and sea lions and seals to fish of all different types and colors that are just interesting looking, unique looking, weird looking. Some are bright orange, some are gray, some are brown, some are just beautiful, absolute beautiful. And they're found not just on the BC's coast, which we're going to be focusing today. They're found all over the world. And they're such an important habitat that we just don't talk about. But today we are here to talk about it because we're here to talk to Scott Bohachyk, who's the director of the Seaforestation program at Oceanwise. Now, Oceanwise is this Canadian organization that is an international organization, but it's based in Vancouver. It covers a lot of different things. It covers climate change. It covers whales. It covers ocean pollution and plastics. It covers overfishing. It covers so many things within those larger programs that have become something of interest for Canadians and something of interest for the international community. They collaborate internationally with a number of different countries and researchers all over the world, and they play a big role. And in Canada, it's important because I'm Canadian, but it's important because there aren't a lot of organizations that are based in Canada that are focused on the ocean. And Oceanwise is one of them. And I think it's a huge part of Canada. It's a huge part of making Canadians leaders in ocean conservation. And I really appreciate Oceanwise. I've wanted to have somebody from Oceanwise on for my entire time doing this podcast. Being able to have Scott on the podcast is such an honor. And to be able to hopefully bring on more people from Oceanwise to be able to talk about the different programs is great. So here we're talking about seaforestation, how they're restoring kelp forests to help protect them and help bolster kelp forests within the ocean, especially along the BC coast. We're going to talk about, what it's like to grow them, how fast to grow them, how long they have to grow in sort of like a nursery area, like in a building, compared to when they have to bring them out. Spoiler, it's not that long. There's a lot of different things that we talk about in this place, and even the barriers to having a big scaled seaforestation around the world. Like that would be amazing. And we talk about those barriers, funding, so forth, but it's great. So I want you to listen. I want you to let me know what you think. So here is the interview with Scott Bohachyk. He's the director of Seaforestation at Oceanwise. Enjoy the interview, and I'll talk to you after. Hey, Scott, welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about Oceanwise, kelp, and seaforestation?
Hey, Andrew. Thanks for having me on the pod. I'm excited to chat a little bit about seaforestation with you today.
Fantastic. This is going to be a lot of fun. I This is a bit of a bucket list for me because Oceanwise, as a Canadian, Oceanwise has been such an important part of marine conservation in general for decades for me. And so I've been watching Oceanwise for a while. I've been watching the programs develop, especially like, the just the seafood program, the sustainable seafood program for Oceanwise develop over years after year after year and become such a mainstay for Canadian restaurants and grocery stores and so forth. And now, Oceanwise has become such this huge conservation organization and a lot of different programs, especially the Seaforestation program, which we're going to be talking about because I'm very excited. I feel like it doesn't get talked about enough, so I'm really glad we're going to be able to talk about it today. We're also going to talk about Oceanwise because I have some questions that I want to get to know, and of course I want to get to know you, Scott, and I want our audience to know who you are and all that stuff. So let's get into that first. Scott, why don't you just let us know who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot. My name is Scott Bohachyk, and I'm the Director of Seaforestation at Oceanwise. I've been in this role for about 3 years and have a background in education and international development and business. I lead Oceanwise's seaforestation initiatives in British Columbia and in Chile. And excited to dig into all things kelp. It's an exciting place to be right now. And thanks for your support and interest in Oceanwise over the last few years.
Absolutely. Now, you have had a pretty wide array of background, but very much environmental focused. What led you to that, especially someone with an MBA? A lot of times when you get an MBA, you go into, the person is generally going into some sort of business because it's a master's in business. What sort of steered you towards that environmental focus throughout your career?
Yeah, well, I mean, not to go on too long-winded biography here, but it really started for me when I was 19. I spent a year in Indonesia, in Sumatra, northern Sumatra, and I just remember my first time driving past some of the clear-cut rainforest, and I found out that that was being replanted with palm trees for palm oil. And just growing up in Edmonton, kind of a young kid, understanding what the impacts of globalization were on the planet, really kind of opened my eyes to some of the more global environmental issues that we were facing. That was around 2004, 2005. I feel like I guess not so much a special time, but a unique time, at least in my own personal journey for the environmental movement, and that just got me kind of on this path. I had always been interested in environmental issues and spent a lot of time outdoors with my family growing up and had that connection to the land and the ocean. But that year was really a moment for me that I decided to dedicate more of my time and really my career towards those issues.
That's interesting too, and leading up to Oceanwise, which is very obviously focused on the ocean. You talk about going to Indonesia, an island nation. You're seeing a lot of stuff on land. Did you have an interest, or did you have an idea of the issues that were going on in the ocean, especially around coastal habitats? Things like kelp, obviously not in Indonesia, but things like kelp, seagrasses, coral reefs, salt marshes, and so forth, and mudflats. A lot of different coastal habitats that are around, but the problems that they were having. Had you had a lot of knowledge of that before coming to Oceanwise?
Before Oceanwise, yes, but I can say at 19, not so much. As I said, pretty much landlocked growing up in Edmonton.
Right.
We got to the Pacific a few times growing up, but I think through over the course of my 20s and 30s, and certainly going back to school for international development, saw the importance of the ocean, not only its intrinsic value, but also kind of how many people, hundreds of millions of people, and really all of us depend on a healthy ocean for our day-to-day well-being. So it was, I don't have a degree in marine biology, and I agree that sometimes the MBA is unique in the nonprofit kind of environmental sector, but we can touch on that a little bit more. But certainly, I think the ocean is kind of having a moment right now, more broadly in the public eye, and more people are really understanding the importance of ocean health.
And I think it's so important that people with MBAs, people with, various business backgrounds or various backgrounds understand, things that are happening to the environment. I think this is a very important aspect to ocean conservation in general, because it's not just scientists. Like I always tell people, I focus that a lot in this podcast, where it's not just scientists that need to be involved in the ocean. It's everybody. We all live part of it. We all benefit from it, but we all are part of the consequences of what we're seeing in the ocean. And to be able to have people who are at different stages in life, different cultures, different, professional backgrounds and so forth, have that ability to open up and just be like, yes, we need to do better and recognize it, and be in positions like your position as director. You almost need to have an MBA, or it benefits you to have an MBA, so that you can manage these sophisticated problems, right? And do you find, in your experience and the people that you've interacted with at the same level, like within an MBA program, because I believe you did the executive MBA program at Queen's, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
You get a lot of people from various backgrounds who are already working. This is something that's done on top of it. It's very, I had a couple friends who have gone through it. It's an intense program. It's a great program. Obviously, Queen's University is one of the best. And but you're getting people from all over the place. Did you have that mindset when you went into like your MBA of like, okay, I'm going to go into the nonprofit sector, and then to speak to people, or were you influenced by people who were also within your cohort to do the same?
Yeah, interesting. Well, I was in the nonprofit sector before going through the executive MBA as well. I was in Ottawa for 5 years with the United Nations Association in Canada.
Right.
And I think, part of the motivation for going into the MBA was just to kind of round out a skill set. In nonprofits, and certainly larger nonprofits like OceanWise, we operate very much like a business in many ways. We've got big budgets to balance. We have revenue targets to bring in. There's milestones and project management activities that must be kind of delivered on time and on budget. So those types of skills are very transferable from the MBA to the nonprofit sector and organizations like OceanWise. But I would also say kind of the main takeaway for me from the Queen's program, and shout out to all my wonderful colleagues that suffered with me through that 18 months, was really understanding how to develop and sustain high-performing teams. It was really around teamwork and leadership, and understanding that how to fit the pieces of the puzzle together to achieve a common goal. And that type of a mindset, I think, is transferable in any organization and in many aspects of your life. And I think I've tried to do what I can to bring some of those lessons and learnings to OceanWise and to the Seaforestation team.
Fantastic. Can you just kind of give people an idea, if they haven't heard of OceanWise before, what OceanWise is? And then after that, can you just kind of tell us what attracted? I mean, I bet you I can tell you what attracted, but let us know what personally what attracted you to work for OceanWise.
Yeah, well, OceanWise is a global conservation organization based in Vancouver, British Columbia. Our mission is to build a global community that takes meaningful action to protect and restore the ocean, in tackling plastic pollution, overfishing, and climate change through research, education, innovation, and direct conservation to ensure healthy marine ecosystems and thriving communities. And we're doing a lot of great work. I'd encourage people to pop by the website or follow us on social media to learn more. You can sign up to the newsletter. We've got a great external communications team that's providing fun and interesting and important updates about our work on a regular basis. And certainly we are looking for more ocean supporters to follow the movement and get involved with OceanWise in a variety of different ways. This is my 6th year actually with OceanWise. So I've been here for some time, and it was just a wonderful opportunity to get into a new arena. I did not, as I mentioned, I didn't have a marine biology background, but from a climate and environmental perspective, I clearly understood how important the ocean was, and I guess if I want to apply perhaps some of the some of the skills or lessons I learned in the MBA, I thought it was kind of a rising stock. I thought it was a good bet, to get into the ocean game. There would be lots of work, lots of development. I mean, the ocean has received really a disproportionately small amount of funding in the environmental movement, and even as a subset of that, kelp has even been more largely overlooked. But yeah, certainly the opportunity within OceanWise, the opportunity to move to Vancouver and be actually a little bit closer to home with my family in Alberta were important reasons, but really just an exciting opportunity to get more involved with ocean conservation.
Well, it's fantastic because, one thing I know in Canada is there aren't many organizations that are strictly dedicated to the ocean. There are a lot in the U.S. Unfortunately, there are not as many here. And OceanWise is one of those few that really stand up for the ocean, not only from an advocacy level, but from a science level, from a conservation level, from a community level. You see, the organization seems to hit at every, from the ground up, essentially, from politics at the top to ground level to community and so forth. It's very grassroots at the same time, and that's one of the things that I really admire about it, and I just love that fact. Now, one of the programs, it has many, is like, so there's like overarching, sort of topics like climate change, ocean pollution, and plastics, overfishing. Whales is a huge thing. Now, under the climate change program, there's the Seaforestation program, which is what you're the director of, and we're going to focus the rest of the conversation on this because it's such an important aspect. Because I don't think a lot of people really understand how important coastal habitats, especially kelp forests, are to our environment, are to the climate change, race, I guess, to reduce climate change. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of kelp and just how the Seaforestation program came? Kelp is obviously a big part of it. If there's other, habitats that are part of it as well, can you just kind of give us a little bit of a brief description before we dive in a little deeper?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, there's so much to say about the importance of kelp. And I think you're right. I mean, lots of people, seaweed and kelp are not kind of everyday topics for many Canadians, unless perhaps you've got some nori on your plate at the sushi restaurant or, something else like that. But, in fact, kind of on the more kind of seaweed aquaculture side of things, some of the products, some of the components of kelp, primarily alginate, is used in hundreds of everyday kind of consumer products that people might not be aware of. So there is this kind of this background of the importance of the seaweed industry globally that is growing quickly. And I think from a land or from a world in kind of constrained land resources, a commodity perhaps such as seaweed that requires no land, no fresh water, no fertilizers or additives, could play an important role in the future of food security and climate around the world. But the Seaforestation initiative at OceanWise is really focused on restoring and protecting wild kelp forests. We have seen a global decline of around 50% of the world's kelp forests. That hasn't happened evenly around the world. There's large kind of temporal and spatial differences in different regions, and there's a variety of different factors for the decline of kelp, but climate change and various ecosystem imbalances are two of the kind of primary suspects for most of the declines. I would say one example is the marine heat blob that moved up the west coast of California and Washington and Oregon and BC and Alaska in 2014, 2015, wiped out about 95% of California's bull kelp, which has not recovered. And so, those types of losses are really devastating for the nearshore ocean ecosystems, because kelp provides just so many different ecosystem services, from support for fisheries, from buffering against coastal erosion, from supporting just a wide variety of marine biodiversity and nutrient cycling, not to mention kind of the carbon sequestration and drawdown potential that kelp and seaweed has in general. There's just a rich abundance of ecosystem services that kelp forests provide that we really need to urgently protect.
Yeah, it seems like there's, as you mentioned, there's been this huge boom in, putting, kelp in clothes, or making clothes from it, making yarn from it, and then food as well. And so there's a lot of these different things that are popping up, even in and they want to do it sustainably, of course, and even in the point where, kelp forests are reduced by a significant amount because of climate change, coastal development, a lot of different things that are happening. So the system itself is in trouble from losing kelp, even with the fact of sea star wasting disease. How we realize sea stars of that disease that succumbed to those diseases were such an important part of keeping sea urchins down. We didn't realize that at the beginning until they were lost some more kelp forests realizing that, and so there's so many things that are activating after it. It makes sense to have this Seaforestation kind of program to come up. So this is this a program where you're protecting existing kelp forests or working to protect existing kelp forests as well as restoration, or is it more of a restoration project that will sort of boost the kelp forest that we see today?
Yeah, so we are focused more on the active restoration of kelp forests in BC. There are some groups who are doing some very important mapping and kind of longer term mapping in the province,
right,
to really understand the trends of kelp forests in British Columbia and what is happening on that side of things. We started 4 years ago the Seaforestation initiative, and right now we have some important projects going on in British Columbia. Actually, just yesterday it was a long and very wet day in Howe Sound with an incredible team. We were out planting some of the green gravel that we had grown at our kelp nursery at the Pacific Science Enterprise Center in West Vancouver. We have a space there generously loaned to us from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and this is where we trial innovative restoration techniques. And this was the third year of successfully growing some sugar kelp on green gravel, which is a unique restoration technique. I won't go into too much detail now.
Right.
Maybe we can focus on it a little bit later if there's a more specific question, but we were out in Howe Sound yesterday out planting that green gravel at the restoration site. So that was a big milestone for us. It's a lot of work to get that project kind of to that point, and we were very pleased that the wind cooperated, although not so much the rain. And we'll be at that site 3 or 4 times in 2026 to monitor the progress. And we were delighted to see some of the kelp that we had planted last year at the site doing well with reproductive tissue, the source on the blades, which was a great win as well. And we have another slightly larger project in Barkley Sound in partnership with the Seychat First Nation. And this is a slightly different approach where we are actually trying to manage the urchin population at an urchin barren. So I was glad that you brought that up, very much on top of your Seaforestation, Andrew, which is great. And we do have an urchin issue in British Columbia. As you mentioned, urchin populations have exploded significantly due because of the functional extirpation of sea otters in British Columbia during the fur trade. Most estimates suggest that we lost around 99% of the sea otters, and then the sea star wasting disease, as you mentioned as well.
Yeah.
Those two primary predators of the urchins being absent have led to really a significant boom in the urchin population, and urchin populations will eat through an entire kelp forest and then remain dormant or kind of in a zombie state where they are actually starving, and they're usually not commercially viable, but they will remain there and really prevent the kelp forest from recovering, and we see huge reductions in biodiversity at those urchin barrens.
I think you mentioned a really interesting point, because here in Canada, we I know on the East Coast and probably on the West Coast, if you can if there's fisheries for urchins, and they use their roe like in like caviar and things like that, and you can get some really cool. They taste interestingly. It's a cool texture and stuff, and it's a big thing here in Canada as well as elsewhere. But you mentioned like they're not in good condition enough to actually fish out. So like, what do you do with them? In terms of like how, like in a place where it's just like a sea urchin barren where they're not going to prevent kelp, because you're not going to spend the money. Because the money and the time and the effort, you just mentioned how, you're not in the best conditions all the time. The BC coast is beautiful, but it does rain. There is wind. It's a coast of the Pacific Ocean. And so sometimes the conditions aren't perfect. So there's a lot of work. It's a lot of people hours to put in. And it's a grunt work to put all these kelp in. And so you want to make sure you have the right spots for it. So, when you have a site where you have this barren of urchins that are not viable for fisheries, do you just skip over that area? Do you get rid of the urchins in that area? How does that work with it when it comes to a complicated site like that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and this is part of how kind of the regulatory environment plays a role in this work as well. And we've connected with several experts from the University of Auckland and a few other organizations in California and Australia who have done some really interesting work on urchin management. And in those jurisdictions, they are permitted through a variety of different means, but sometimes through kind of like a scientific permit or a restoration permit to actually go and call the urchins. And the example from New Zealand is there were kind of 4 2-hectare sites, and they were allowed to call the urchins to get that urchin density down from about 20 urchins per square meter to 1 or 2. And that's kind of what you need to get the density down to relieve the grazing pressure of the urchins enough for the kelp to have a good chance to recover. In Canada right now, we're not quite at that. We're not quite at that stage yet where we're able to go and call. And of course, that would be a conversation with the First Nation and other local community members as well, if that was something they were interested or supportive of. And we've been developing all the projects that we've trialed and are currently doing in British Columbia with First Nations. We don't have any projects that don't kind of engage the First Nation early on and throughout the project. But interestingly, in the New Zealand example, there was actually some initial resistance to the culling of the urchins, but they kind of got permission to try it, and the results were very positive. The kelp bounced back very quickly, actually, as long as you just kind of take that pressure off. Nature proves its resiliency usually time and time again. And then once the kelp forest was kind of back and they could see this really positive outcome, the social support and kind of that social license was actually quite a bit stronger to continue and to expand. And so I think in this sense, it's a little bit of a short-term pain for long-term gain situation where, of course, we don't want to call the urchins, but if the end outcome is a healthier kelp forest, more balanced ecosystem, and all the other benefits that a thriving kelp forest would provide, then I think we have to weigh the options in front of us.
Well, and you'd also see a rebound of those urchin populations within that area as the kelp forests grow, providing that safe hiding spots in an area where they can eat, but eat sustainably and not destroy the regrowth of the kelp forest. So I think it's a great point that you raised there, because sometimes when you see these things work and how fast they come back, kelp forests like grow really fast, and I don't think so it's a great. It's a great organism to work with because they grow so fast and they grow so tall. So it's great to see. You mentioned earlier, I want to talk about a little bit of that growth, because you mentioned earlier there's an area that DFO lent a sort of a structure, I guess, like a building that you can plant these. How long do you allow the kelp to grow from, I guess, seedling or propagule to to an outplanting before you actually go put it out? Like, how long does it take to grow? And when do you to a point where you're like, okay, these are ready to go out to the ocean?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we really enjoy giving the odd tour, particularly to some of the school groups we've had at the Kelp Nursery. It's great to show people the process because it really is quite novel for a lot of people, and I have to give a lot of credit to Max and Dana on my team, two Seaforestation specialists who have really led the work in the nursery over the last 2 years, and I would say almost the problem we have is that we've become too good at growing kelp in the nursery, and it grew too quickly. And once you actually refine and kind of nail down the right conditions for kelp, it can really take off. So we probably we'll probably move up our timelines about 2 weeks for the next batch that we will start in January. But to answer your question, it takes about 6 weeks. So the overly simplistic kind of steps of growing kelp in the nursery is we'll go out to a local population of kelp in around late September, mid-September, collect some of the sorus from the blades. And the sorus is just where kind of the reproductive tissue of the kelp is. And once we have that, we'll take it back to the nursery. We'll kind of actually sterilize it in iodine so that we kind of remove some of the other organisms. We want the kelp to grow, but we don't want everything else attached to the kelp to grow in the lab that we have. So we want to try and mitigate some of the other growth. And then actually we layer that sorus in paper towel overnight and put it in the fridge. And that kind of stresses the kelp to release the spores. Then we come back the next day, put it in a solution, put it in some sterilized seawater, and the water instantly goes cloudy. And that's what we call kelp soup. And, and I don't think anyone's ever tasted it, but this is what we put on the cobbles, on the rocks, which kind of are really the basis of the green gravel technique that I mentioned earlier. Yeah. And we'll spray those sporophytes, the gametophytes on the boulders. And essentially, there's a lot more to it in terms of the monitoring and the nutrients and the lights and the temperature. But after about 5 or 6 weeks, we'll start to see just a little bit of fuzz on the rocks. And that's the baby kelp that's growing there. And then we can go and take those rocks out to House Sound as we did and place them at the restoration site. So it's become quite a science, for us. And Max and I were there 3 years ago with the first batch, having never grown kelp before. But when we saw the first kelp underneath the microscope in the fall of 2023, we were delighted. So we've come a long ways.
Well, even thinking, like, I thought they'd have to be a lot bigger. I thought they'd have to be, say 2 feet or things like that. The fact that just like, no, once they start to you start to see them on the rocks, you can just put the rocks. That's really cool to see. And then it'll just grow from that. I think that's amazing. I didn't think it would be that. That surprised me. That got me. I wasn't ready for that. Cool. That was cool. That's awesome. Now we mentioned, the ecosystem services that kelp provide, which is great. But as we get into, growing them, and you said, you're going to monitor them, over the year as you grow, as they grow. Why is monitoring such an important, like standardized monitoring? And like there's a field guide, there's a guidebook, that Oceanwise and Kelp Forest Alliance put out. Why is that important, to use in the field for monitoring, and why is standardized monitoring important for this project or program?
Yeah, also a great question. I think this is really a focus for us at Oceanwise and the Seaforestation Initiative over the next year and two, and really beyond. And even to go back to an earlier comment that you mentioned at around the site in Barkley Sound, around kind of the biodiversity uplift. This is where we're going to be installing an underwater camera to monitor, the recovery of the kelp forest and understand better kind of the urchin behavior and urchin dynamics as well. Yeah. And it's going to have, a live stream to YouTube, so people can
That's what I was waiting
watch.
for. That was my next question. That's exactly awesome. Yeah.
So we're really excited about that, and I think there's certainly a very rigorous science component to that, but also I think the communication and just bringing people a little bit closer to our work in a very remote part on the west side of Vancouver Island there in Barkley Sound. It's difficult to get to, and I think we are trying our best to bring this work a little bit closer to people and their everyday lives, make it more accessible. So, but that's a big part of the monitoring piece, and we were delighted to publish the Monitoring, Reporting, and Verification guidebook last year with the Kelp Forest Alliance. They've been a strong supporter of ours, and I would encourage folks, if you are interested in kelp restoration, to go check out the website. There's a lot of interesting resources there, and they're doing great work to kind of coordinate the global community of practice around kelp restoration. And they have a database there to upload restoration projects. And really one of the main motivations to draft the MRV guidebook was to help standardize the way that kelp forest health are measured and monitored, so that when organizations, communities, and other practitioners in this space are uploading their data, hopefully the idea is that more of it would be used or would be collected using the same method, so we can compare more easily apples to apples, oranges to oranges, and then hopefully understand a little bit better about which techniques have worked best and where there's room for improvement, and really to help the sharing of knowledge and lessons learned. So, the monitoring for us is extremely important to understand what has been working and what has not. I think it's just as important. We've set a culture inside the organization and inside the initiative that we need to fail fast and learn from those mistakes and build off that. But we also don't want to duplicate the wheel. So under having those databases like with the KFA, and also some of the regional hubs that and communities of practice that we're a part of, kind of allow us to allocate time and resources in the most effective way. And I guess even just to add on to that quickly, the monitoring is important from both kind of a carbon drawdown point of view. We'd be interested to help, or we'd be interested to start understanding a little bit more in detail the carbon stock of the kelp forests, as well as the biodiversity gains that we see between an urchin barren and a kelp forest, and then also the social and cultural value to the forest, to communities and indigenous nations that have used kelp forests in a variety of ways for millennia.
It's really interesting you mentioned that. It's leading into my storyline is perfect with you, because you lead right into my next question, which is fantastic. I was going to ask about the biological or ecological goals, and then of course the climate related goals, which is such an important part these days as we're really starting to see climate change rear its ugly head in the consequences that we're seeing. Kelp forests are they play such an important role for carbon capture and climate mitigation, but they also play a role in sort of like biodiversity and habitat restoration. Do you have to balance those goals? Is that something that you have to worry about? Are there trade-offs? Like in certain areas, you're more hopeful for carbon capture, so maybe there's a species that's a little bit better in carbon capture, or there's a species that's a little bit better in fostering biodiversity and more of that builder. I don't know much about the interplay between the species, and of course it'll depend on where you're restoring, because you want native species and things like that. But I guess the original question is, like, do you have to balance the ecological goals and the climate related goals?
Yeah, it's a good question. I wouldn't say that there's many trade-offs. I mean, I guess if you wanted to use some extreme examples, but this wouldn't really be restoration. I mean, there are some groups who have tried growing seaweed in the open ocean and sinking it, as a way, as kind of a marine CDR technique. So, that there's pros and cons around that. I think, I think there's probably there's better ways to use that seaweed in that biomass, and there's probably more effective ways to pull carbon in a better way out of the atmosphere. But I'm also not closing the door on any options, because we really do need kind of everything in front of us and all hands on deck in the fight against climate change. So But for us, I mean, we're focused on the resiliency and the health of the kelp forests, and then all the associated benefits that come after that are really just kind of the positive outcomes that we're hoping for. So, kelp as a climate ally, certainly, I would say 5 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, there was a real buzz around kelp as kind of a climate change ally and silver bullet, and it certainly is. But it's not going to sequester as much carbon, perhaps, as some people thought. It does grow very quickly. It can grow up to a foot or 45 centimeters a day with some species. It can draw down a lot of carbon. But what percent of that gets buried in ocean sediments or exported to the deep abyss, and how much is actually sequestered for longer periods of time is a really difficult question to answer. And that's why the carbon credit market for kelp forests have not really become mature yet.
Right.
So, our focus is more so on the biodiversity. We really want to get a better grasp of those benefits and other ecosystem services down the road. But right now, within the Seaforestation initiative, we're treating kind of the carbon and the climate piece as a little bit of the cherry on top. The rest of it.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, you're kind of getting both when you do it, and that's the benefit of growing kelp. We focus, and as a biologist, obviously I focus on the ecological goals. We've talked about climate. We haven't talked about the benefits to sort of the social benefits. So the benefits to indigenous communities, the benefits to communities at large. How are those incorporated into the Seaforestation program to ensure that social dimensions are included?
Yeah, it's also a great question. I think we've done some great work with the Seychat First Nation to bring out some youth from the community with us on the boats. As we go to the restoration sites, we had help from 3 wonderful high school students last year who were kind of rolling up their sleeves and getting their hands dirty. And
nice.
I really hats off to them, because it was hard work for a few days. I think that's an important opportunity, particularly with young people and young professionals, to showcase various careers in conservation. I mean, there's a lot of different career pathways for young people. And I know that, in rural and remote communities, these types of jobs can provide some really great livelihoods for folks in the communities where perhaps there's more limited options. And I think with the nation, I wouldn't want to speak on their behalf, but I know that we have been fortunate to spend some time with some of the elders at the Seychat First Nation. And, to summarize or to paraphrase a little bit, I mean, thankful that we're out there and we're trying to do some of that work with them, but also wanting to lead that work themselves. And that goes towards the restoration activities and the monitoring. And we've been really, really pleased to work as closely as we have with the nation, but we've got some funding to provide some other dive training for community members, and that's part of the capacity building within the nation that we hope will kind of allow more of the nation to lead more of the activities in Barkley Sound at the restoration sites through the actual delivery of the restoration activities and the monitoring and the reporting. There's a whole bunch of interesting data analysis work that we're going to have done, and I think the cultural value of kelp has been there within the community for a very long time, and something that we're excited to kind of help grow again.
Yeah, and growing this Seaforestation program, are there specific, I guess, economic or policy mechanisms that are essential for scaling this program up?
Yeah, so that's interesting question. I just had a very interesting conversation with someone about kind of the economic benefits of restoring kelp forests, and that's something that the federal government is more interested in. I think it started in some ways with the 30 by 30 agenda and creating more MPAs, but I think there's a little bit more desire to understand, okay, the MPA the marine protected area has been created, but what is the economic benefit associated with that? How do you measure the conservation benefit of that? And I think right now, the ecosystem services of kelp, it's certainly an underestimation, but Dr. Aaron Eager, who is the executive director of the Kelp Forest Alliance I mentioned earlier, released a paper last year with an estimate of some of the ecosystem services values of different species of kelp. And the rough numbers were that each hectare of kelp per year produces around $60,000 to $145,000 US per hectare per year. And that's just accounting for some of the fisheries support and then some of the carbon sequestration and nitrogen fixation. So, all of the other ecosystem services values is not included in that. So that's why I say that number is likely an underestimation. But our issue right now is that we can't bring that ecosystem services value into these projects in a meaningful way. And until we do that, I think it's going to be difficult to have the budgets and the financing to scale restoration to a really globally significant level, because they're chronically undervalued. It is really the issue. And if they are producing $100,000 or $150,000 per year in ecosystem services, then how do we make the business case to the right investors or whatever to actually invest in kelp forests, because they are really one of the greatest investments we can make in the ocean.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They definitely are. It's something I think you get your best bang for your buck, I feel, with kelp forests. So I think it's
that's our new logo on the Seaforestation initiative is kelp is the best bang for the buck. So
I love it. I mean, you look in a kelp forest. I live just outside of Toronto, and I go into the aquarium, the Ripley's Aquarium. Yeah. And they have a great display for kelp forests. You see all the species that are there, like just the fish species. They're not taught. They don't show sort of the invertebrate species. They don't show the marine mammals that live in there and that thrive in there. The sea stars and so forth. It is such an important aspect to for stability, for biodiversity, for security. It's just great. But there's a lot of things that go with restoration. It's not as easy as we're making it sound right now. You've talked about some of the physical problems with that, but what are some of the biggest scientific or even practical uncertainties when we look at global kelp restoration right now, like the effort? So is it genetics? Is it resilience monitoring or monitoring, ecosystem interactions, invasive species, like climate change? What are some of the things that are really hindering or some of the biggest barriers towards restoration, kelp restoration?
Yeah, well, I mean, unfortunately, it's a little bit of all the above.
All of the above, yeah.
And I think certainly, I sound like a broken record probably on the funding piece, but it is expensive work. These are remote locations, and I think the rough stat is that about 95% of kelp restoration projects are 1 or 2 hectares in size, because they're quite expensive, to operate and to do, to kind of grow at scale. So there's certainly a financial component, but I think as we look to the future, it's, we've got questions around where are the best places to focus restoration efforts in a world, in a warming world and warming ocean. We've got an interesting project with the University of British Columbia and the University of Victoria to do some past modeling of kind of of kelp forest spatial extents in BC. but also, and then kind of looking forward under a few different climate scenarios, where might our efforts be best placed and other efforts be best placed in the province to focus on restoration efforts, because there is a thermal tolerance that kelp has, and above that temperature, it cannot reproduce, it cannot survive, and it's what we've seen in certain spots throughout the province. Most notably, I'd say in the Strait of Georgia, we're seeing much higher temperatures. And so then it also goes into the question of, what kind of selective adaptation we might pursue. There's kind of a genetics part of this, which is, I think, quite controversial, and rightly so. But, how do we protect the genetic diversity of BC's kelp forest, but also how do we best set ourselves up for a warmer world? And there are pockets of kelp that have proven to be perhaps a little bit more resilient to higher temperatures. Should those genetics kind of act as the foundation for future restoration efforts? These are hotly contested questions for sure. I think they deserve a lot of scrutiny, but I think we do need to recognize that things are changing very quickly around us. So, there's a regulatory component. I would argue that kelp has really flown under the radar in most global environmental agreements, and I'm not exactly, don't quote me on this 100%, but I know kelp has received just a fraction of the funding that coral reefs have, for example, despite kind of having kind of a 5 to 7 times larger area than coral reefs. And I don't want to get all the coral reef restoration folks angry at me. I'm not picking a fight, but
absolutely, totally agree with you. Totally couldn't agree more with you. Yeah, no, it's
we need to increase that funding for kelp forests as well. Sure. They cover 30% of the world's coastlines, so not insignificant.
For sure. Looking at, we talked about funding. We talked a lot of the barriers facing kelp restoration. Looking forward past, say, 2030, what does success look like for Seaforestation? What are we looking at? Scale, outcomes, changes you would make, that you would make, or would make you say, consider Seaforestation as a win for oceans and climate?
Yeah, I think, beyond 2030, I think we would be able to look at, hundreds, if not thousands of restoration projects, at the community level, where kelp forests are thriving again and resilient, and really having the data to back that up, being able to kind of visualize the success of that work, and having kind of a co-managed and, a local solution to some of these issues, because there's no one right way to go about kelp restoration, and folks with local knowledge and the history of the place will best know how to go about and what's most appropriate. I think the work that the KFA and others are doing is great in terms of connecting the global community of practice around kelp restoration. I'd like to see that, strengthen. These local regional networks that we're a part of are growing and strengthening. More people are getting into kelp. I was actually, Max, Dana, and I were lucky enough to go to the International Seaweed Symposium this year in Victoria in May, and it's kind of like the Olympics of seaweed, where there's 500 PhDs in phycology and seaweed that were just so impressive, and there's so much interesting research going on in the area, so that needs to continue to develop. And I would say, the alignment with the government regulations and the regulatory frameworks, to support the restoration work that is going on in the nearshore ecosystems and around Canada. Really, I would say that we could be doing a bit more to remove some of the challenges facing restoration organizations on that side of things. And really, once if we can get alignment on some of the funding and the regulatory piece and the community buy-in, then I think the door opens for really significant success in the coming years.
I'm a science communicator, right? That's what I do. This is the podcast. It's to inform people. I have a lot of early career researchers. I have a lot of, and scientists and conservationists. I have a lot of people who are activists on here. I have a lot of people who are just interested in knowing what they can do to live for a better ocean. That's my tagline. As a science communicator, and I have a lot of fellow science communicators, what can we do? What do you think we can do to build sort of that broader public awareness for these underwater forests and the restoration that's so important to keep these forests going?
Yeah, great question. We've also struggled, I would say, because it's hard to bring people to kelp forests. They're under the water. It's often quite cold, and et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, one way that we have done this at OceanWise is through our mobile education programs. We have our Sea Dome, which is a bit like an inflatable dome. You can fit about 30 kids inside, and there's a 360-degree 4K video that projects on the inside of the dome. And so it's kind of like you're underwater, and it's been extremely successful over the last few years, reaching tens of thousands of students across Canada. And so that's one way that we're trying. I think, I recently saw some virtual reality headsets that you can put on, and you dive underneath the water and through the kelp forest. And I think that's one of the most immersive, really, really moving ways to go about it.
Yeah, talk about connecting to the ocean, right, without getting wet.
Yeah, it's
it's
really
yeah.
It's really incredible. So I would say, continue, from a science communication standpoint, I think continuing to bring guests on who can talk about kelp forests and their importance in different ways. I think we need to raise awareness around just how important kelp forests are and what they provide. Not that there's also just a wonderful intrinsic value to kelp forests, but from a kind of an objective standpoint, they provide just so much benefit to humanity that it's very much in our best interest to protect and restore. And I would say try and learn more about kelp in your region. If you are near the ocean, go along the shoreline and see what type of seaweed or kelp is washed up. It's sometimes I feel like it's not that well known. People are stepping on it and maybe slipping on it if they take the wrong step. But these are really important species and ecosystems that are usually pretty close by if you're somewhere near the ocean in Canada.
That's amazing. So, are you a diver, snorkeler?
Yeah, I do both. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. When if you've gone diving on a kelp forest, when you go diving or when you're in there, what's your favorite part of diving in a kelp forest? Like, what do you look for or hope to see every time you go diving on a kelp forest?
Yeah, it's a really special experience. It's really like stepping into another world. I mean, the kelp forest, it's a three-dimensional structure. The light shines through in just the most beautiful way. As long as the visibility is good.
Yeah.
And the abundance of the biodiversity and marine species inside the kelp forest is so impressive. They're kind of quiet. It's a little bit hypnotic. They're waving back and forth in the water, and it's just a very special experience. So when I'm there, I'm just trying to take it all in, be in the moment, enjoy the rare kind of time that I get to be in the water and among the kelp. I know Max and Dana are kind of in there a little bit more than I am, but I'm trying to change that. And I think ultimately they just give me hope. I think they're such a positive aspect.
Mm-hmm.
They're a source of positivity in the world
sure.
right now, and it just reminds me of that every time I'm near them.
I think it gives such a beautiful look of what we don't understand about the ocean. I think when a lot of people picture the ocean, they picture coral reefs, they picture or just blue and nothingness, like in a say open ocean. When you look at a kelp forest, there's so much to look at, like from the ground up, and not only just the kelp forest, but the fish, like I said, the invertebrates, the sea stars, even the sea urchins. You might see a sea otter, you might see a seal or a sea lion, coming through every once in a while. There's all these different aspects of it up and down that Pacific coast. And it just gives you a different breadth of what the ocean can be. And it's absolutely gorgeous. I've never gone diving on kelp forest. I look forward to doing it someday. It is on my bucket list because it's one of my favorite exhibits at any aquarium that I go to, and it's something that I look forward to, and it provides that connection, like you said, like the hope that you could have a productive ocean. And I think having any way we can, whether you want to get wet and connect or you want to go virtual and connect, I think any way to connect is such an important aspect to understanding just the biology that's down there, the importance of it down there, and how people really rely on these habitats to survive. I just want to say thank you so much for coming in and talking about Seaforestation. I'd love to have you back on, or anybody else who's part of Seaforestation back on, or even Oceanwise at large. It'd be really great to have more people talk and give that audio or visual of what these areas look like. It's such an important aspect to not only Canadian life but ocean life in general. And kelp forests are our future, and they were part of our past, and they need to be part of our future as well. So I want to thank you so much for coming on. It's been a great experience to meet you and hear all about Seaforestation.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on, Andrew. That was fantastic. And if you find yourself out here in Vancouver in the darker, rainier months, that's when we're kind of most active in the water. So there's a possibility there. And we've got lots of other really wonderful folks at Oceanwise. If there's other subjects that we want to explore, there's lots of important work to be done to improve ocean health, and I think we'd be delighted to come back on the show in the future. So yeah, thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.
You bet. Thank you, Scott. I appreciate it. Thank you, Scott, for joining us on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. It's great to have you on. I hope it's not the last time I see you. I hope we'll see you many, many times. We can talk about specific projects. Of course, Oceanwise, anybody from Oceanwise would love to have you on the podcast to talk about the different programs. This is a huge thing for me. Like, to be able to connect with somebody from a great organization like Oceanwise is absolutely massive. As a Canadian, as a marine biologist, as a science communicator, to help disseminate this information to you, I think it's super important and must be done more. So hopefully we'll have them back on for more. Let me know what you loved in this interview. Was it the fact that we talked about restoration and the mechanisms of restoration? Was it the fact that we talked about how important kelp forests are? Was it the fact that we talked about some of the barriers to scaling up a program like this? Let me know what your thoughts on kelp forests. Let me know if you use a product that has kelp in it. I would love for you to tell me. Let me know in the comments below if you're watching this on YouTube. If you are listening to this on your favorite podcast app, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, whatever that might be, love to hear from you. If you go to speakupforblue.com/feedback, you can either write a comment or you can leave a voicemail. I'd be happy if you want, just let me know in the voicemail to play that voicemail on the next episode, answer your questions or listen to your comments. I think that would be something that's really great. It's a new program that I'm trying out. I'd love to hear your feedback. It goes directly to me. If you don't want it to be shared, no worries. If you want it to be shared, that would be great. I could share that as well. speakupforblue.com/feedback. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can use that too, or you can use the comments below. But I just want to build that community, get more interaction. Love to talk about the ocean. As you know, I talk about 3 times a week, probably more than that behind the scenes, but I really love to do that. So check it out, subscribe, follow, whatever you need to do. I love all of you. I love the fact that you want to learn more about the ocean, and I get to be the person to tell you about it. And I want to thank Scott and Oceanwise and Seaforestation for coming on the podcast to let us know more about Seaforestation. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, from the True North Strong and Free, and for the host of this How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day. I'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.